Ganu Desai's print entitled Dedication depicts the 16th century Rajput princess Mirabai, a historical figure turned saint and icon. A symbol of unconditional and fearless loyalty to her beliefs, Mirabai is etched into the Indian consciousness as an emblem for rejecting the status quo. Desai's portrait depicts a front-facing Mirabai with her eyes downcast, looking upon a clay oil lamp perched on a lotus flower. On first glance, the viewer's eyes follow Mira's gaze downward to the swirling flame, but the soft, curving lines bring the eyes back up to the focal point of the composition, Mira. The quote, lyrical quality of Desai's illustrations can be seen further in the idealized treatment of the subject's face, free of imperfections, yet naturalistically rendered through the shading of the nose and eyes. At the same time, the painting adheres to the flattened style characteristic of traditional Indian art. Originally published in the 1930s, this work was one among 10 prints published together in a volume entitled Mirabai, 10 Pictures from the Life of India's Greatest Poetess of the Past. This collection of lithographs would go on to be reprinted nearly a decade later, in 1943, a testament to the enduring popularity of Mirabai in the early 20th century, a pivotal historical moment in the anti-colonial struggle in India. Taking this publication as a point of departure, my thesis approaches this work through 3 lenses. The first is through Ganu Desai's artistic education under influential figures including the printmaker and magazine editor Ravi Shankar Raval and Nanda Bose, one of the chief pioneers of the famous Bengal School of Art, established at Shantiniketan near Calcutta. The second is on the socio-political context within which Desai produced his Mirabai folio. The third considers the market for fine art books. Through these 3 angles, this paper seeks to understand the significance of Desai's Mirabai publication and what it sought to achieve during its lifetime. I should note that Ganu Desai's work has received almost no attention from scholars. Thus, my thesis presents entirely new material and conclusions drawn through an amalgamation of these lenses. Today's presentation has 3 parts. First, I will discuss the historical context surrounding Mirabai, both in terms of her significance during her own lifetime and in terms of her revival in the early 20th century. Second, I will turn to a close analysis of select folios, looking at the intersection between Desai's artistic training and the political environment within which he worked. Finally, I will briefly explore the intentions behind certain changes in the original run and reprint, with the former containing Hindi verses from Mira's songs and the latter being entirely in English and supplemented by an expository foreword. Born in 1498 AD, Mirabai is best known as one of the most devoted followers of the Hindu deity Krishna, an incarnation of the protector deity Vishnu, and as a nomadic singer of bhajans, or devotional prayer songs. From a young age, Mira developed an affinity for Krishna, with whom she believed herself to be spiritually wedded. The story of Mira's life was defined and distinguished by 2 qualities. 1, her unwavering faithfulness to Krishna, and 2, her subversion of, quote, the normative pattern of values associated with powerful and entrenched social institutions. According to her hagiography, she was married off by her father into the Sisodia royal family in Rajasthan. However, she continued to worship Krishna as her one true husband. In addition to refusing to consummate her marriage, she also refused to accept her bridal family's deities. Mira's blatant disregard for customs and tradition created a contentious relationship between herself and her in-laws. Upon her earthly husband's death, she refused to wear a white sari, the traditional garb of a grieving widow. After her death, Mira became an iconic figure, taking on a mythical significance as a female guru or religious teacher, and a symbol for passive protest within the Bhakti movement. Literally meaning the cultivation of a passionate devotion to God, the Bhakti movement centered on saints, who composed devotional poetry in vernacular languages rather than in the elite language of courtly Sanskrit. Because of its emphasis on vernacular languages, The movement democratized and equalized devotion, undermining the institutional monopoly over religious practice and enabling participation across class and gender boundaries. Thus, Mira became synonymous with passive protest and democratization. This legacy led to Mira being chosen as a paradigm by Mahatma Gandhi and other leaders of the Indian national independence movement, as she exemplified the idea of endurance in the face of extreme external pressure. She also served well as a symbolic figure, whose courageous rejection of the status quo seemed particularly apt at a time when the country was struggling in the pursuit towards freedom from British colonial rule. Her name and image were also invoked for the purpose of encouraging women to take part in political activism and step out of their traditional roles as wives and mothers. Gandhi's decision to underscore Mira's heroism proved to be a powerful motivator for many women to join the resistance. This early 20th century nationalist movement provides the backdrop with which to examine Kanu Desai's Mira by publication. Originally published in the 1930s, the collection was reprinted in 1943, 1 year after the Quit India campaign was launched, with the intention of amping up the pressure on Britain to leave India. Desai himself was politically active during his lifetime, participating in marches and even publishing a fine art book containing sketches of Gandhi. In addition to Mirabai, Desai also published a series of prints depicting other well-known Indian historical figures. The styles that Desai made use of in these depictions were well suited for their subject, and reflected his early training under prominent art masters Ravi Shankar Raval in 1922 Ahmedabad and Nandala Bose in 1925 Shantiniketan. It was under the apprenticeship of Raval that Desai was introduced to publicly circulated media. As one of Raval's most promising apprentices, Desai later continued on to complete his studies under the guidance of Bose in Shantiniketan, one of the most prominent pioneers of the Bengal School of Art, which was closely aligned with the growing nationalist movement. It was during this educational experience that Desai was introduced to Bose's artistic philosophy of, quote, nature, tradition, and originality. Akin to Gandhi's independence movement, which rejected the dominion of Britain in India, the Bengal School rejected the academy-style curricula. Instead, the Bengal School advocated for a return to traditional pre-colonial approaches to Indian art practices and materials. In looking for inspiration, they turned to a diverse range of sources, including Mughal and Rajput miniatures and popular Kalighat paintings, and they embarked on a journey of cultural exploration, visiting historical sites such as the Ajanta caves in order to strengthen their connection and understanding of their artistic predecessors. Thus, the Bengal School can be understood more succinctly as an ideology, rather than a predetermined and consistent set of stylistic choices. This school of thought sought to awaken within each of its artists the cultural consciousness that had been suppressed by a multitude of external factors, so that it could manifest in their artworks and inspire others. The Shantiniketan movement did not seek to emulate the past, or the artistic choices of other artists, but rather to interact with their river of tradition, marking this artistic movement as modernist. No longer was this subject matter solely the center of the composition, but rather how the artist reacted to and engaged with the chosen theme. Keeping this in mind, we can now move on to consider Desai's training and context. Before delving into a close analysis of Desai's print, it is important to understand the Bengal School's interest in the intersection between the artist and the craftsman, and its approach to style. The artists of the modernist school were influenced by rural life and interested in bridging the gap between artist and craftsman. Additionally, their works were executed with natural colors and materials, such as watercolor and fresco, in keeping with practices of earlier artists in India. This return to traditional materials also represented a rejection of Western academic practices that were taught in British colonial-era art schools. This was parallel to anti-colonial protests, which advocated for rejecting imported goods, such as clothing and fabrics, in favor of supporting local khadi or cotton industries. The first print I consider is the Poison Cup, which contains two figures both dressed in white. The beaded necklace and handbells on the central figure identify her as Mira. In her right hand is a shallow dish that she appears to be bringing to her mouth. Both figures' gazes draw the viewer's eyes to this object. Mira is depicted in traditional profile view, while the figure behind her is illustrated in full frontal, with her hands resting on either of Mira's arms. The imagery, combined with the title of the illustration, convey to the viewer a key moment in Mira's life. Mira's contentious relationship with her in-laws only intensified with the death of her husband. As one account explains, after the passing of her husband, Mira was asked by her bridal family to commit the Rajput tradition of sati, a practice whereby a widow would throw herself onto the pyre of her deceased husband. Mira refused to do this, on the grounds that her true husband was Krishna. Naturally, this angered her in-laws, who demanded that she drink a cup of poison as punishment. As Mira drank the poison, she focused her mind on Krishna, and thus remained unharmed. This account is one of the best-known episodes in Mira's life story, and is featured in one of her bhajans. Quote, "A cup of poison was sent by the king. It was turned into nectar." The underlying message of Mira's devotion to Krishna enabling her to fearlessly face death and to be saved from her earthly obstacles was a powerful sentiment. This idea of spiritual intervention also follows a larger tradition of devotion, with many accounts of Vishnu saving individuals who declare their devotion to him, existing in Indian mythology. The second print I consider is Lure of the Lute. The title of the piece, Lure of the Lute, is a reference to Krishna's flute, which he was very fond of and played often, as well as to Mirabai's poetry, which often describes the alluring music. Quote, "At the sound of flute, my senses leave me, my body trembles." The flute, alongside other symbols such as Mira's handbells and her diya, are combined into an assemblage and used as a framing device on every page of the folio. Compositionally, the print is vertically arranged, with Mira below and Krishna floating in a petal-like shape above. Mira's left hand is fully extended upward in front of Krishna, pushing the deity further into the background. The floating figure can be identified as Krishna through the flute he is playing, the peacock feather in his hand, and his blue skin, all conventional visual symbols used to represent Krishna. Similar to most prints in the folio, Mira is dressed in white garb with a beaded bracelet. The artist uses the red thread, hanging from both of the bells and the flute that Krishna is playing, in order to tie the composition together and provide visual stability. The background of the work consists of abstracted vertical strips of color. Desai's use of line, specifically in the stole hanging from Mira's head, which combines layers of curved lines in abstract and uneven forms billowing out, gives the sense that the figure is reacting to forces outside the scope of the composition. The frontal treatment of Mira's face, with the characteristic almond-shaped eyes, is consistent with other works in the collection. Lure of the Lute can be compared with an earlier work by Ravi Varma, a late 19th century artist well known for producing oleographs, a printing technique that mimicked the aesthetic of oil painting. Varma's Mirabai, like all of his works, adhered to the Western academic traditions that were later consciously rejected by the Bengal modernists. The print features Mira, full frontal, in the center of the composition. Her downcast eyes take the viewer's gaze to the shrine dedicated to Krishna, located on the right-hand side of the foreground. The work also contains a highly illusionistic Krishna, with the coloring of the skin and chiaroscuro along the chin line, a classic example of the Western tradition. The vibrancy of the colors can be viewed as a byproduct of the artist's chosen medium. Varma's shading and coloring create a sense of three-dimensionality within the figures, with even inanimate objects such as Mira's sitar, bells, shrine, and statuettes having a sense of mass. In addition to this, The translucent nature of Mira's dupatta underscores the forms underneath, and the torsion in Mira's pose brings a sense of movement to the composition. Varma's illustration of Mira is also draped in colorful clothing. Overall, the composition creates a sense of mysticism, with the amalgamation of curved, swirling lines and unnaturalistic bright green background only emphasizing this notion. Two similarities between Desai's Lure of the Lute and Varma's Mirabai are the composition and presence of movement. Both place Mira in the center of the work, directly below Krishna. However, while Varma opts for a highly idealized Krishna, Desai has rendered him much smaller and with far less detail. Similarly, in both, Mira is represented as active, in the middle of the devotional act of producing music. Yet while both artists achieve the same result, movement, their methods differ and change the overall effect it has on the viewer. Whereas Varma uses the torsion in Mira's body and the positioning of her hands to achieve movement, Desai uses Mira's drapery to render the sense of mobility. Desai's stylistic choices result in the work maintaining its stylized quality, imbuing it with a spiritual quality that transcends a mere formulaic rendering of the saint. Desai's print is able to situate the source of Mira's spirituality within Mira herself, rather than through any exterior elements. For instance, the position of Mira's hand, with the bell pressed up against Krishna, seems to suggest that his presence is invoked through her music, which was an act of devotion. In this way, Mira becomes the key focus, or the idea that by following her example, one can also experience Krishna. By contrast, while Krishna is equally present in Varma's work, there's less emphasis on the link between Mira's devotion and Krishna. Finally, I turn to the 1943 reprint, and particularly to the decision to only include English translations of the title with the images. While it is possible that Desai was simply trying to expand his market, the fact that he was active in the anti-colonial movement suggests a broader politics. The reprint contains an English foreword written by Theosophist Sophia Wadia, who lauded the artist's goal of circulating his images in order to, quote, bring to the Occident, through these pictures, the soul-quickening message of India, who is the spiritual mother of the Aryan race. Note that in this context, the term Aryan refers to the original meaning, or Indo-Iranian, which was a religious label used by people during the Vedic period of ancient India. In this way, Mirabai serves as a vessel for emphasizing the significance of India's artistic and spiritual traditions to a largely Western audience. The importance of Mirabai for this audience lay in what she embodied. In her foreword, Wadia focused on Mira's life story in order to demonstrate to new viewers how she embodied a personification of, quote, soul struggles and, quote, self-purification, also expressed through Desai's images. By contrast, the original 1930s printing did not include any context. All of the text was in Hindi, and the audience would have been assumed to be Indians. The particular interest of theosophists, such as the famed Sophia Wadia, in Desai's work is worth noting. Interested in devotional religion, mysticism, and Indian religion specifically, theosophists are categorized as cultists, and the party's current position is a testament to its enduring popularity in the West. While specifics may not be known, we can say with almost certainty that Desai had particular links to international theosophists. Just 2 years earlier, in 1941, another well-known theosophist, James Cousins, wrote the foreword for Desai's publication Rang Lahari. James Cousins had also written a play in 1919 entitled The King's Wife that emphasized the, quote, universal love of God that recognized no distinctions between Hindu and Muslim and certainly claimed no religious exclusivity. The play itself, while historical fiction, mentions Mira by name, and in the preface, Cousins states that the character is meant to represent the saint. Thus, it is not a stretch to postulate that Desai was capitalizing on the popularity he had garnered both locally in India and abroad through the creation and circulation of fine art books such as the Mirabai Folio, which exemplified the notion that Mirabai's appeal transcended Hinduism. In the end, Kanu Desai's Mirabai Folio underscores a field of study within the survey of Indian art that has yet to be explored. 1930 India represents an epoch on the cusp of independence, and the artists such as Desai demonstrated the ability to successfully cater to the growing Western taste for Indian devotion-related cultural products. Yet, the fact remains that there is no scholarship on Desai. One possibility for this may be the scarcity in research and/or archival records of this particular period, especially when compared to other parts of the world. Another may be the language barrier. Majority of the documentation is in Gujarati, while the emphasis in studying modern India has been on the Hindi, Bengali, and English archives. So, by breaking the surface of this artist's body of work, this research hopes to bring awareness to this lost Bengal school artist, his contributions to modern Indian art, and his curious engagement with broader international audiences.